The signal came from a dying world, and it was never supposed to reach anyone at all. Ketthara Station orbited a soft blue planet called Ilion, home to the Ketthari, a species of slight, quiet beings who had never fired a weapon in anger in over 400 years. Their cities were built from woven coral glass. Their music was older than most empires. Their entire planetary defense force consisted of 11 unarmed patrol skiffs meant to track weather balloons. They were not ready for the sky to open up and vomit warships. Station Commander Vesto stood on the observation deck and watched the Vantari fleet drop out of slipspace in a formation that looked, from a distance, almost beautiful. 17 warships unfolding in a slow, deliberate bloom, their hulls the color of old rust and older blood. She had seen images of Vantari ships in the historical archives. She had never expected to see them over her own sky. Commander, her communications officer's voice cracked. They're not hailing us. They're not responding to any channel. They're just burning our comm relays. Ale finished, watching 3 of the warships peel off toward the orbital array. I know. The Vantari Empire had been expanding along the outer spiral arm for 6 years, and everyone in this sector had heard the stories. They didn't invade. They didn't negotiate. They arrived. They burned every structure capable of calling for help. And then they descended to harvest. A word the Ketthari had learned meant something between conquest and extermination, depending on how useful your species turned out to be. Get everyone to the shelters, Ale said, and get me the deep band array. The old one. The one nobody uses. Her comm officer, a young Ketthari named Osu, looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Commander, that array hasn't been active in decades. It's not even cataloged in the current registry. Who would we even be calling? Nobody's supposed to know, Ale said quietly. That's the point. She had read about the Deathworlder Accord exactly once as a child, in a footnote of a footnote in a historical text her grandmother kept locked in a cedar box. It was not taught in schools. It was not part of any official galactic protocol. It was old. Older than the Empire. Older than the current governing charters of half the species in this arm of the galaxy. A whisper network frequency, seeded generations ago into deep space relay stations by an alliance that no longer existed, tied to a species that the Empire's own historical records described, when they described it at all, with a single flagged warning, do not engage. The Ketthari had never engaged with anyone. They had certainly never engaged with whatever the Deathworlders were, but Vesto had 11 unarmed skiffs, 400,000 civilians and 17 Vantari warships descending on her planet, and she had run out of other options roughly 4 minutes ago. Broadcast on the deep band, she ordered. All channels. Every frequency in the old registry. Tell them who we are. Tell them what's happening. Tell them. She paused, feeling faintly ridiculous even as the first orbital strike lit up the sky over the northern hemisphere. Tell them we're asking for help and we don't care who answers. 211 light-years away, in a system so far off the standard trade lanes that most star charts didn't bother naming it, a signal arrived at 0347 ship time and did something no signal had done in the 11 years since the receiver was installed. It triggered a Priority 1 alarm. Captain Elena Voss came awake the way she always did, instantly, completely, with her hand already on the light panel before her eyes had fully opened. 11 years flying salvage runs and escort contracts along the fringe had trained that reflex into her bones. She'd learned it originally somewhere else, somewhere she didn't talk about much, but the reflex didn't care where it came from. It just worked. Cass, report, she said, swinging her legs off the bunk. The ship's AI answered in the dry, unhurried tone it always used, even for emergencies. We've received an inbound transmission on the deep band emergency array, Captain. Deathworlder protocol. Origin coordinates place it in the Ilion system, Ketthari territory, Sector 9. Elena stood very still for a moment. The Kestrel Rose was a decommissioned Colonial Deep Survey corvette, 41 years old, patched together with 3 different hull alloys and an engine that Marcus swore was held in place by spite alone. She was not a warship. Not officially. She carried a 5-person crew, a salvage claim license, and enough scars, on the hull and on the people inside it, to fill a much bigger vessel. She had never, in Elena's 11 years commanding her, received a Deathworlder distress call. Nobody had, as far as Elena knew. The protocol was a relic, A ghost frequency seeded across a few hundred old relay stations by people who were dead or scattered a century before Elena was born, tied to an old alliance and an older promise that most of the galaxy had long since forgotten existed. She'd only known about it because her first captain, a grizzled old woman named Dorsa Kale who'd fought in wars Elena had only read about, had insisted every ship under her command carry the receiver. In case, she'd said, and never elaborated further. Elena had installed one on the Kestrel Rose out of habit and superstition more than anything else. "Play it," Elena said. The recording crackled through the bridge speakers. A voice, alien, translated roughly by the ship's linguistic core into something choppy and desperate. 400,000 civilians. No defense capability. Requesting any assistance, any response. We don't care who answers. Behind Elena, the rest of her crew was gathering on the bridge in various states of undress and alertness. Marcus Aldana, the engineer, bare-chested and scowling, a wrench still somehow in his hand. Priya Chandrasekaran, their pilot, already dropping into her seat out of pure reflex. Tomas Reyes, ex-military, moving like a man who'd been woken by worse things than an alarm and had learned to distrust the calm after. And Nadia Kovic, their medic, arms crossed, watching Elena's face for the answer before anyone asked the question. "That's a war zone," Thomas said flatly once the recording ended. 17 ships, orbital bombardment already in progress by the timestamp. "That's not a rescue, Captain. That's a funeral we'd be flying into." "I know what it is," Elena said. "We're one ship," Marcus added, not unkindly. "One very old, very tired ship, with 4 pop guns for point defense and a hull that groans in a stiff breeze. We are not the cavalry." "I know that too." Priya hadn't said anything yet. She was looking at the star chart, already calculating the burn. That was Priya. She processed the universe in vectors and fuel curves. And somewhere in the middle of that math, she usually arrived at the same conclusions as her gut, just later and with better justification. 211 light years, Priya said. At max slip burn, that's 11 hours. They'll have taken the planet or left the system long before we're anywhere close to relevant. Maybe, Elena said. Or maybe 17 warships bombing a planet with no defense force isn't a war. It's a harvest, slow, they take their time. I've heard the story same as you, Nadia finally spoke. So what do we actually do, Elena? Say it plain. Elena looked around at her crew. 4 people who had all in their own ways ended up on the ragged edge of known space because they'd run out of other places to belong. She thought about an old woman named Dorsa Kyle, and a receiver installed out of habit and a promise nobody currently alive had any memory of making. We answer, Elena said. That's what the frequency is for. Somebody built that system so that if this exact moment ever happened again, somebody would come. I don't know who they were. I don't know why humans specifically, but I know the call came in and I know we're the ones who heard it. One ship isn't going to stop an empire, Marcus said quietly. No, Elena agreed. But one ship can decide not to let 400,000 people die without anybody even showing up to see it happen. Nobody argued after that. Priya was already plotting the burn. Thomas was heading for the armory, cataloging what they had, which wasn't much. Nadia was pulling up whatever medical intelligence existed on Kethari physiology, which also wasn't much. Marcus muttered something about the engine and whether it would survive 11 hours at max burn, and went to go find out. Elena stayed on the bridge a moment longer, looking at the star chart, at the small blinking marker 211 light-years away, that represented a planet full of people who had sent a message into the dark, not knowing if anyone would ever hear it. Cass, she said. Send a response. Let them know somebody's coming. Message sent, Captain, Cass replied. A pause. For what it's worth, the last recorded activation of this protocol was 137 years ago. There's no data on what, if anything, answered that time. Then let's make sure there's data this time, Elena said, and reached for the burn controls. The Kestrel Rose came alive around her, old bones groaning, engines spinning up toward a burn they were never rated for. Behind her, one by one, her crew took their stations, not because anyone ordered them to, but because none of them had ever been the kind of people who could hear a call like that and do nothing. 211 light-years away, the bombardment continued and nobody on Ilion had any reason yet to believe that help was coming. They were about to be very surprised about who had answered. Grand Marshal Thren, Vok watched the bombardment from the command deck of the Ashvane's Reckoning, with the particular boredom of a man who had done this exact thing 43 times before. The Kethari were not fighters. They had never been fighters. Their entire species had built a civilization on the premise that conflict was something that happened to other people. And for 4 centuries, the galaxy had mostly let them believe it. That kind of naivety made for excellent harvests, minimal resistance, minimal collateral damage to the infrastructure worth keeping, minimal expenditure of Vantari lives and ordnance. "Orbital array is down," reported his tactical officer, a broad-shouldered Vantari named Scarrett, with the kind of flat, efficient voice that Thren had promoted him specifically for. "Surface defenses, such as they were, are neutralized. We can begin the ground descent within the hour. Casualties?" "None, Grand Marshal. Not on our side." Thren nodded, unsurprised. This was the 44th world he had harvested in 6 years of campaign, and the pattern rarely varied. Some species fought harder than others, but the Kethari were about as close to a bloodless conquest as the job ever offered. He almost felt something like sympathy for them. "Almost, sir." A junior communications officer approached, hesitant in the way junior officers were always hesitant, when they weren't sure if what they'd found was important or a waste of the Grand Marshal's time. "We intercepted an outbound transmission from the planet before we took the relay array down. Deep band frequency. Encrypted in a protocol our systems don't have a match for." "Encrypted how?" "That's the strange part, sir. It's not encrypted in any conventional sense. It's just old. Older than our translation matrices. The system flagged it because of the destination coordinates embedded in the packet header. It wasn't a general broadcast. It was addressed, specifically." Thren frowned. "Addressed to whom?" The officer hesitated again, and this time it wasn't uncertainty about relevance. It was something closer to genuine unease. "The header designation translates roughly to Deathworlders, Grand Marshal. It's an old term. I had to pull it from historical linguistic archives. It hasn't been in active use in generations." Something in Thren's chest went very still, in a way he didn't examine too closely and would have denied if asked. "Show me the archive entry." The officer complied, and the display populated with a fragment of text. Old, badly preserved, clearly copied and recopied so many times across so many centuries of Vantari record-keeping that half of it had degraded into administrative noise, but the parts that remained legible were enough. Species designation human, homeworld classification Deathworld Prime. Engagement not recommended under any circumstance. Surviving accounts from the Sindrata reclamation campaign indicate losses inconsistent with force disparity. Sindrata fleet strength 81 vessels, engagement duration 11 days, survivors 0. Recommend permanent avoidance protocol be maintained in all future strategic planning. Thren read it twice. Then a third time. "This is from the Sindrata records," he said slowly. "The old campaign? Before the Reformation." "Yes, Grand Marshal. Before my time. Before yours as well, I believe." Thren had heard of the Sindrata reclamation the way every Vantari officer heard of it, as ancient history, a footnote from before the current dynasty, back when the Empire's borders had looked entirely different, and half its present territories didn't yet exist. He had never had cause to look closely at what actually happened there. Nobody did. It was old news, dead news, the kind of history that got summarized into a single line in a training manual and never unpacked further. 81 vessels, 0 survivors. He looked at the small, unassuming ripple of energy still visible on his sensor board, the trace signature of the outbound transmission, already 200 light-years gone and accelerating away into the dark, carried by relay stations he had no way of tracking. "Grand Marshal?" Scarrett prompted. "Orders?" Thren considered it for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was, in his experience, more than sufficient time to make a correct decision, and he had commanded 43 successful campaigns on the strength of trusting that instinct. "It's an old signal," he said finally. "Ancient history and a dead frequency, likely broadcast on a system nobody's monitored actively in a century. Even if by some absurd coincidence anything answers, it's 200 light-years out. We'll have the planet fully secured and this fleet 3 systems away before anyone arrives to find out." "And if something does arrive?" Thren almost smiled. "Almost. Then whatever primitive scrap of a species is still rattling around out there answering 100-year-old distress beacons can watch us finish what we started." and learn the lesson their ancestors apparently forgot to teach them. He turned back to the main display, where the last of Ilion's surface defenses were flickering out one by one. Begin the ground descent. I want harvest teams on the surface within the hour. Yes, Grand Marshal. Thren dismissed the archive fragment from his display with a flick of his hand, and did not think about it again for 11 hours. 11 hours felt like a very long time and no time at all. Elena spent most of it on the bridge, watching Priya nurse every last fraction of efficiency out of the burn, watching Marcus disappear into the engine room and re-emerge periodically looking more exhausted and more satisfied in equal measure, watching Thomas run drills with weapons that hadn't seen real use in years. Point defense cannons are functional, but they're built for debris fields, not warships, Thomas reported, laying out their full arsenal on the mess table like a grim inventory. We've got the mass driver. Good punch, slow reload, maybe 6 shots before the coils overheat. Missile rack's got 4 birds left, older model. No guidance upgrades since I don't know when. And that's it. That's the whole ship. That's not a warship's loadout, Nadia said. It wasn't a question. No, Tomas agreed. It's a salvage tug's loadout that got bolted onto a survey hull that got repurposed as an escort ship, that got repurposed again as whatever the hell we are now. We are roughly the least qualified vessel in known space to fly into a fleet engagement. Good thing we're not planning a fleet engagement. Then, Elena said, arriving in the doorway. Everyone looked at her. We can't win a stand-up fight against 17 warships, she said, sitting down at the table. Nobody's arguing that. But that's not the job. We've got 11 hours to figure out what the job actually is. Which is? Marcus asked, wiping engine grease off his hands with a rag that had long since stopped being useful for that purpose. Buy time. Save lives. Make ourselves so much more trouble than we're worth that they decide harvesting this particular planet isn't worth whatever. It's costing them. Elena pulled up the sensor data. They'd gathered from the Kethari transmission, sparse, but it painted a picture. Orbital bombardment, no active defense fleet, 17 warships in a standard harvest formation. This isn't a war fleet expecting resistance. Look at the formation. Look at the approach vector. They came in slow, methodical, no evasive posture. That's a fleet that has never once been meaningfully challenged. Which means they're going to be sloppy, Priya said from the pilot's chair, not turning around, still running numbers. Overconfident, predictable. Which means one ship flown right might be worth a lot more than 17 ships fighting an enemy they respect, Elena said. We're not going to outgun them. We're going to outthink them. And we're going to make sure that every single thing we do makes them wonder what else is coming. Thomas leaned back, arms crossed, studying her with the particular look he got when he was deciding whether an idea was insane or merely difficult. You're talking about making 5 people and 1 busted survey. Ship look like the opening move of something a lot bigger. I'm talking about making them remember why that old frequency had a warning label on it, Elena said. Somebody built the Deathworlder Accord because humans earned that reputation once, a long time ago, against people like this. I don't know all of that history. Dorson never told me the details. But I know reputations like that don't come from being reasonable. They come from being the last thing an enemy expects over and over, until they stop expecting anything at all. Nadia was quiet for a moment, then said, You really think 5 of us can pull that off? I think, Elena said, that a species that decided to fight wars on a planet that's actively trying to kill them every single day doesn't measure its odds the way an empire that's had 43 easy victories in a row measures its odds. They're counting ships. We're going to give them a reason to start counting something else. Outside the viewport, the stars streamed past in the long white blur of slipburn, and somewhere ahead of them, unseen and unknowing, a planet full of people who had never fired a shot in anger were about to discover exactly what kind of help had answered their call. 11 hours, and counting down. By the time the Kestrel rose dropped out of slipburn at the edge of the Ilian system, the harvest had already begun in earnest. Elena watched it happen on the main display in the kind of silence that came from seeing something confirmed exactly as bad as you'd feared. Ketathera Station, the orbital hub El Vesto had broadcast from, was a smoking ruin tumbling slowly along its old orbit. Below it, the planet itself was scarred with the long, dark lines of ground assaults. Landing craft descending in orderly columns, harvest teams moving through what had once been quiet coral glass cities. The 17 warships of the Vantari fleet sat in high orbit, unhurried, confident, spaced out around the planet like a net that had already caught its fish. Cass, passive scan only, Elena said quietly. I don't want them to know we're here until we decide they should. Understood, Captain. Running passive analysis now. The data populated slowly across the display. Ship classes, weapon loadouts, formation gaps, comm traffic patterns. Elena had spent 11 years reading exactly this kind of information. First because someone had trained her to, and later because it had kept her and her crew alive more times than she could count. Talk to me, she said. Formation's exactly what we expected, Priya said, tracing patterns with a finger over the display. Loose, spread wide for orbital coverage, not defense. Half those ships probably haven't run a combat drill in years. Look at the spacing on the port flank. There's a gap big enough to fly a corvette through without tripping a single sensor sweep, if you time the patrol rotation right. How confident are you in that timing? Thomas asked. Give me 20 minutes of observation and I'll give you an answer you can bet your life on. Which, incidentally, is exactly what we'd be doing. Do it, Elena said. While Priya watched the patrol rotations, Thomas pulled up what little intelligence they had on Vantari tactics, cross-referencing it against the sensor data in real time. Command ship is that one, he said, indicating the largest vessel in the formation, sitting slightly apart from the rest with the particular smug distance of something that considered itself above the actual fighting. Ashvane's reckoning according to the comm chatter Cass is picking up. Everything's routing through it. Kill the head, the body doesn't know what to do. That's true of most military hierarchies. And everything about this formation says these people have never had to think for themselves in a crisis. We are not killing a command ship with a mass driver and 4 old missiles, Marcus said flatly, from where he'd been quietly monitoring the engine readouts and trying not to think too hard about what the captain was clearly building toward. No, Elena agreed. We're not. We're going to make them think we might, Nadia, who had been reviewing the medical data on the Kethari, and quietly trying not to imagine what 400,000 casualties actually looked like, finally spoke. There are people down there dying right now while we plan. I understand the tactics, Elena, I do. But what's the actual plan? Because make them nervous isn't going to stop harvest teams on the ground. Elena nodded slowly. You're right. So here's what we do. Priya gets us through that gap in the formation. Quiet, no engagement. We don't go for the fleet first. We go for the harvest teams on the surface. Small, fast targeted strikes on their ground transport and command coordination. We make their harvest operation grind to a halt without ever directly engaging a warship. That buys time, saves lives right now, and it does something else. What else? Thomas asked. It tells them somebody's here who knows exactly what they're doing and isn't afraid to do it under their nose. An empire that's had 43 easy conquests doesn't know what to do with an enemy it can't see and can't predict. We're not going to win by being stronger. We're going to win by being the single strangest thing that's ever happened to Grand Marshal Thren Vox's career. Marcus let out a long breath. You know his name. Cass pulled it off their unencrypted comm chatter 20 minutes ago, Elena said. Turns out an empire that's never been meaningfully challenged also doesn't bother encrypting most of its internal traffic. That's the kind of mistake that gets you killed against the right enemy. She looked around at her crew. We're going to be the right enemy. Priya spoke up from the pilot's seat, still watching her patrol timers count down. Gap opens in 6 minutes. It'll stay open for approximately 90 seconds before the rotation closes it back up. I can get us through, but it's going to be close. And if I'm wrong about the timing by even a few seconds, we're going to end up inside their formation with 17 warships and nowhere to run. Then don't be wrong, Elena said. And there was no pressure in it, only trust. The particular kind of trust that came from having flown with someone through worse odds than this. Priya's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Never have been yet. The next 6 minutes passed in the specific quiet of a crew that had run out of things to plan and had only the doing left. Thomas ran a final check on the mass driver and the missile rack. Nadia prepped the medical bay for casualties they all hoped wouldn't be their own. Marcus stayed with the engine, murmuring to it the way he always did before a burn, as if 41 years of accumulated mechanical stubbornness could be coaxed along with the right tone of voice. Elena sat in the command chair and thought, briefly about Dorsa Kale, dead 6 years now, buried on a colony world Elena hadn't visited since the funeral, and about the receiver that woman had insisted on installing on every ship she ever commanded, and the word in case that had never come with an explanation. Gap opening in 30 seconds, Priya said. Take us in quiet, Elena said. Weapons hold until my order. We're a ghost until we decide not to be. The Kestrel Rose slid forward into the dark, engines throttled down to the barest whisper of thrust, running lights dark, every non-essential system powered to minimum. On the display, the gap in the Vantari formation opened exactly where Priya had promised it would. A sliver of unwatched space between two patrol vessels, running their rotation with the lazy precision of ships that had never once needed to imagine an intruder in their midst. They slipped through with 11 seconds to spare. We're in, Priya breathed. Inside their formation, low orbit approach still reading passive. Nobody's seen us. Good, Elena said, watching the surface data resolve as they descended. The burning cities, the harvest columns, the long lines of Kethari civilians being herded toward transport ships by Vantari ground teams, who moved with the bored efficiency of people doing routine work. Thomas, target their ground transport convoy, the one moving toward the northern extraction site. Non-lethal disruption if we can manage it. We want chaos, not a body count. Copy that, Thomas said, already keying targeting solutions. Mass driver's got the range. Recommend we hit the lead vehicle and the rear vehicle simultaneously. Traps everything in between. Stops the whole column without us needing more than 2 shots. Do it. The Kestrel Rose banked low over the burning coastline of Ilien's largest continent, and for the first time in 6 years of unchallenged Vantari conquest, something other than a Vantari ship opened fire. The first shot took the lead transport vehicle clean off its tracks in a burst of dust and scattered debris, and the second, half a second later, did the same to the rear. Between them, 9 other vehicles ground to a confused, tangled halt, hemmed in on a narrow coastal road with nowhere to maneuver. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened at all. The Vantari ground team simply stood there, staring up at a strange, unmarked ship banking low overhead, trying to process a variable that did not exist anywhere in 43 campaigns worth of institutional experience. Then the shouting started. That's the reaction we wanted, Elena said, watching the chaos unfold on the tactical display as the Kestrel Rose pulled back up into a shallow climb. Nobody's firing back yet. They don't know what we are. They will in about 4 seconds, Tomas said. And he was right. The nearest Vantari picket ship, a mid-sized escort vessel that had been running lazy orbit, sweeps a few hundred kilometers out. Suddenly lit up with active targeting scans. Contact, Priya announced. Escort vessel breaking formation, moving to intercept. Let them come, Elena said. That's 1 ship, not 17. Priya, keep us low. Use the terrain. I want that mountain range between us and their long-range batteries as much as possible. The Kestrel Rose dove for the mountains, and the pursuing escort vessel, sleek, fast, clearly built for exactly this kind of interception, closed the distance with unsettling speed. They're faster than we are, Marcus called up from the engine room, watching his own readouts. In a straight line, they'll catch us in under 2 minutes. We're not planning on a straight line, Elena said. Priya, take us into the canyon system on the eastern ridge. Tight terrain, hard turns. They're ships built for open engagement, not for threading a needle. Copy, Priya said, and the Kestrel Rose dropped hard, engines screaming. Hull groaning in protest as she wove the old survey ship between granite walls that had stood on Ilien for longer than either species involved in this fight had existed. The Vantari escort followed, but slower, clumsier, forced to check its speed at every turn where Priya, flying an old ship she knew in her bones, cut the margins razor thin. They're falling back, Priya reported, a note of fierce satisfaction creeping into her voice. Can't match our turn radius in this terrain. Then let's give them a reason to stop trying, Elena said. Tomas, when we clear the canyon mouth, I want a missile on their engine section. Don't kill them. Cripple them. A limping ship broadcasting distress calls back to the fleet does more work for us than a dead one. Thomas's hands moved fast over the weapons console. Solution locked. On your mark. The Kestrel Rose burst out of the canyon into open sky and Thomas fired. The missile, old, unglamorous, one of only 4 they had left, struck the escort vessel's rear engine housing dead center, and the ship lurched sideways in a spray of atmosphere and debris, tumbling out of pursuit entirely. venting a long trail of vapor as it fought for stability. Direct hit, Thomas confirmed. They're not chasing anymore. They're just trying not to fall out of the sky. On the bridge of the Ashvane's reckoning, Grand Marshal Thren Vok received the report with an expression that had not, until this exact moment in his entire military career, ever needed to accommodate genuine confusion. Say that again, he said. A single unidentified vessel, Scarrett repeated, standing rigid at the tactical console. Small, non-standard configuration, possibly civilian in origin based on hull profile. It disabled our ground transport convoy at the northern extraction site, then engaged and crippled the Varan's Blade in the eastern canyon system. The Varan's Blade is currently unable to maneuver and requesting emergency retrieval. One ship. Yes, Grand Marshal. Thren stared at the tactical display, at the small red marker representing this single, impossible vessel, now vanishing back into the canyon system, untraceable against the terrain clutter. 43 campaigns, 43 worlds that had, in one form or another, understood the futility of resistance the moment Vantari warships entered orbit. He had never once had a single vessel, not a fleet, not a defense force, a single ship, disable a convoy and cripple a warship in the same engagement. The archive fragment surfaced in his mind again, unbidden. Sindrata fleet strength 81 vessels. Engagement duration 11 days. Survivors 0. He dismissed the thought irritably. One crippled escort and one disrupted convoy did not constitute the beginning of a catastrophe. It constituted an anomaly, and anomalies had explanations. Pull the ground teams back to the fortified extraction zones until we identify this vessel, he ordered, and get me a full sensor sweep of the system. If there's one ship down there causing this much trouble, I want to know where it came from and I want to know if it's alone. And if it is alone, Grand Marshal, Thren allowed himself a thin, humorless smile. Then whoever is flying it is either the bravest fool in this arm of the galaxy, or they know something the rest of us don't. Either way, I intend to find out which. Deploy 3 additional escort wings to hunt it down. I want it disabled and captured, not destroyed. I have questions. Back on the Kestrel Rose, deep in the canyon shadows with engines running cold to avoid thermal detection, Elena watched the Vantari fleet's tactical response unfold on their own passive scans. The sudden recall of ground teams, the launch of 3 new escort wings fanning out in a search pattern across the eastern hemisphere. They're rattled, Priya said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. They're cautious, Elena corrected. That's not the same thing and it's more dangerous. Rattled enemies make mistakes. Cautious enemies start doing things properly, and that's when we lose our advantage. So what do? Nadia asked, arriving on the bridge with a medkit still in hand. Having spent the last 20 minutes preparing for casualties that, so far, hadn't come, Elena studied the tactical display, watching the search pattern of the 3 escort wings, watching the recalled ground teams regroup at their fortified extraction zones. We can't keep hitting them the same way twice. They'll adapt. We need to be somewhere they're not looking, doing something they don't expect. She traced a line on the display down toward the largest of the fortified extraction zones, where thousands of Kethari civilians were being held under guard, awaiting transport off-world. That's where the actual harvest happens. That's where the people are. If we can disrupt that operation even temporarily, we save lives directly, not just tactically. That's also going to be the most heavily defended position on the planet, Tomas pointed out. I know, Elena said, which is exactly why they won't expect us to go there next. Everything in their doctrine says a ship that just hit an isolated convoy and a lone escort should keep hitting soft, isolated targets. Nobody sane brings one lightly armed ship against a fortified extraction zone. Marcus, listening over the comm from the engine room, let out a short, tired laugh. Captain, with respect, were we sane? Not particularly, Elena admitted. But we're the only help those people have got, and I'm not interested in being cautious when caution means watching this get worse. Priya plot us a route to the extraction zone. Low quiet, hugging terrain the whole way. We're not going in to fight 17 warships. We're going in to make Ael Vest those people believe, for the first time since this started, that someone actually came. Priya's hands moved over the controls, and the Kestrel Rose eased forward out of the canyon shadows, angling toward the distant glow of the largest extraction zone, where the true weight of the harvest was only just beginning. Behind them, unseen, The search pattern of 3 Vantari escort wings swept steadily closer to their last known position. And ahead, Grand Marshal Threnvok's fortified defenses waited, entirely unaware of exactly how much trouble one small, stubborn human ship was about to bring to their doorstep. The extraction zone sprawled across a wide river delta on Ilian's western coast, a temporary Vantari installation of prefabricated barracks, holding pens and heavy anti-air batteries built in the space of a single day by an occupying force that had done this exact thing 43 times before and had the process refined to a science. Elena studied the layout on the long-range scan from a ridge 15 kilometers out. The Kestrel rose powered down to a whisper, hidden in the tree line. "That's a lot of firepower for holding unarmed civilians," Nadia said quietly, looking at the density of the anti-air batteries ringing the perimeter. "That's not for the civilians," Tomas said. "That's for us, or for whatever they think we might be." He pointed to a cluster of readings near the center of the compound. "And that's new. Bigger power signature than anything else on the ground. That's not standard harvest equipment." Elena leaned in, studying the readout. "Cass, can you identify it?" "Insufficient data for a positive identification, Captain," Cass replied. "However, the power signature and structural profile are consistent with a mobile command and control installation, likely deployed specifically in response to our earlier engagements." It would explain the timing. "They're not just guarding the extraction zone," Elena said slowly. "They've turned it into a trap. They know we hit soft targets. They're betting we'll come here next, and they've built a kill box waiting for us. So we don't go," Marcus said over the comm. "Simple as that." "It's not that simple," Elena said. "There are thousands of people in those holding pens, and every hour we don't act is an hour closer to those transport ships lifting off with them aboard. Once that happens, we lose any chance of getting them back." She studied the compound layout again, turning the problem over. "They built a trap assuming we'd come in the way we came in before. Fast, low, direct assault on the perimeter. So we don't do that. What do we do instead?" Priya asked. Elena was quiet for a moment, thinking not about tactics but about the 400,000 people on this planet, and the 11 hours it had taken to get here, and the fact that somewhere down there, Aelvesto, whoever she was, had sent a message into the dark with no real hope anyone would answer it. "We give them exactly what they're braced for. Somewhere they're not braced for it," Elena said finally. "Thomas, how many decoy transponders do we have in the salvage rig?" Thomas blinked. 6, maybe 7. We use those for marking debris fields on long recovery jobs. Why? Because a fleet that's never fought a real war doesn't just believe in one impossible ship, Elena said. It starts believing in a fleet of them, if you give it a reason to. We deploy the decoys in a wide arc around the perimeter, timed to light up their sensors in staggered sequence, like multiple ships converging from different vectors. Meanwhile, we come in the one direction their kill box isn't built to cover. "Which direction is that?" Marcus asked. Elena tapped the display, indicating the river delta itself, where the installation's rear perimeter backed directly onto marshland and open water. "Nobody builds heavy anti-air coverage facing a river they don't expect anything to come from. We go in low, over the water, under most of their scan coverage, while their attention is fixed on 6 ghosts converging from the tree line." Priya was already running the numbers, a slow grin spreading across her face. "That could work. It's insane, but it could work." "It has to work," Nadia said quietly. "Aelvesto and everyone in those pens are counting on it, whether they know it or not." 40 minutes later, the Kestrel rose skimmed low over the dark water of the river delta, running lights dead, engines throttled to their absolute minimum thermal signature, while 15 kilometers away, 6 decoy transponders began lighting up Vantari sensor arrays in a staggered, deliberately chaotic sequence. On the bridge of the Ashvane's reckoning, Scarrett watched the sensor board erupt into a flurry of contact alerts with the particular dread of a man watching his careful plan unravel in real time. "Multiple contacts," he reported to Thren, who had come to stand beside him the moment the alerts began. 7 distinct signatures converging on the extraction zone from the northern tree line. Formation is irregular, staggered approach vectors. 7 ships, Thren said slowly. "From 1. Unless there are more of them than we believed, Grand Marshal." Thren stared at the display, feeling something cold settle in his chest that he refused to name. 43 campaigns. He had never once needed to question whether an enemy force was larger than it appeared. He had never needed to. Redirect the escort wings to the northern perimeter, he ordered. All of them. I want that tree line lit up before anything gets within firing range of the compound. Yes, Grand Marshal. While 3 escort wings and the bulk of the extraction zone's ground defenses pivoted their full attention towards 6 blinking transponders in an empty forest, the Kestrel rose silently out of the river delta and slid through the undefended rear perimeter of the compound like a knife through fog. We're inside their wire, Priya breathed, hardly believing it herself. Nobody's even looking this way. Thomas, we're not here to fight, Elena said. We're here for the holding pens. Cass, do we have a clear read on where the civilians are being kept? Central compound, Captain. 3 large structures, minimal guard presence. Most security personnel have been reassigned to perimeter defense given the current alert. Then that's our target. Priya, set us down as close as the terrain allows. Thomas, Nadia, you're with me. Marcus, keep this ship ready to move the second we're back aboard. Copy that. Captain. The Kestrel Rose settled into a shallow landing amid the chaos and noise of a compound whose attention had been almost entirely pulled elsewhere, and Elena, Thomas, and Nadia moved fast and low across open ground toward the holding structures, where thousands of Keththari civilians sat crowded together under a thin guard, waiting for transport ships that would carry them away from everything they had ever known. Inside the nearest structure, Ael Vesto sat against a cold metal wall, her 4-year-old nephew asleep against her shoulder, and tried very hard not to think about what came next. She had sent a message into the dark 11 hours ago. Nobody had come. Nobody was going to come. That was simply the shape of the universe she had learned to expect. Over the course of one very long, very terrible day, the door at the far end of the structure blew inward in a shower of sparks, and 3 figures stepped through, small, by Keththari standards, unarmored in any conventional sense, moving with a speed and purpose that stunned the handful of Vantari guards inside before any of them could raise a weapon. Elle watched, frozen, as the guards fell. Not killed, she realized after a stunned moment, but disabled, dropped hard and fast and left breathing on the floor. And then one of the 3 figures turned toward the crowd, pulling back a helmet to reveal a face that was, unmistakably, entirely unlike anything Ale had ever seen in person before. My name is Elena Voss, the human said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden, stunned silence of 400 civilians who had given up hope roughly 11 hours ago. I got your message. I'm sorry it took so long. We don't have much time, so I need everyone to listen very carefully and move exactly when I tell you to. Somewhere behind her, in the ruined doorway, Thomas was already working the lock mechanism on the second holding structure, and Nadia was moving through the crowd checking for anyone too injured to move fast. El Vesto, station commander, keeper of a secret her grandmother had passed down in a locked cedar box, stared at the human standing in the wreckage of the doorway and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since the bombardment started. Hope. You're the Deathworlders, she said, half question, half disbelief. Elena's mouth quirked, something that wasn't quite a smile. I've heard that name exactly once, about 11 hours ago, and I still don't fully understand it. But I answered your call. Let's get your people out of here, and maybe by the end of this we'll both understand it a lot better. They moved 412 civilians out of the holding structures in 11 minutes, not to the Kestrel Rose, which could never have carried a fraction of that number, but into the marshland beyond the compound's rear perimeter, where the dense reeds and standing water would hide them from aerial sensors, long enough for Elena's next move to matter. This isn't a rescue, Elena said to Ael Vesto as they moved, both of them crouched low, guiding the last stragglers toward the tree line. Not yet. It's a delay. I can't fly 400 people off this planet in one ship. What I can do is buy your people time and make it a lot harder for the Vantari to keep pretending this harvest is easy. Why? Elle asked, and it wasn't suspicion in her voice, just genuine bewilderment. Why would you do this? You don't know us. Your species has no treaty with mine. You answered a signal that hasn't been active in a century, for a species you'd never heard of, and you brought one ship against an empire. Elena thought about that for a moment, moving low through the reeds, watching the sky for any sign the decoy diversion was failing, because somebody, a long time before either of us were born, built a system so that when a moment like this happened, somebody would come. I don't fully know why humans. I don't know the whole history. But I know what it feels like to send a call into the dark and not know if anyone's listening. And I wasn't going to be the reason that feeling turned out to be right. Ale didn't answer that immediately. Behind them, the sound of Vantari escort wings roaring back over the tree line. Having finally discovered the decoy transponders were exactly that, echoed across the delta. They're going to realize the civilians are gone soon, Thomas said, jogging up alongside them. And they're going to realize exactly where the gap in their perimeter came from. I know, Elena said. Nadia, how many still need help moving? A handful. Elderly, mostly. We're managing. Nadia's voice was tight with the particular strain of a medic doing triage in the field with far too few hands and far too little time. Elena keyed her comm. Marcus status. Ship's hot and ready the second you're aboard, Captain. But Elena, sensors picking up something new. All 3 escort wings just broke off the search pattern and are burning hard toward our position. And Priya's reading a larger contact inbound from high orbit. Big one. How big? Command ship big. Elena's jaw tightened. Threnvok himself, coming to see personally what kind of enemy had turned his 44th easy harvest into a genuine crisis. Get everyone into the marsh cover and stay low, Elena told Ale. Your people should be safe here as long as they stay hidden. The ground team's attention is about to be entirely on us. You're drawing them away, Ale realized. That's the idea, Elena said. It's not a plan I love, but it's the one we've got. She sprinted the last stretch back to the Kestrel Rose with Thomas and Nadia close behind. And the ship was lifting off the moment the airlock cycled shut, engines screaming as Priya threw them into a steep climbing turn away from the compound and directly into the path of the incoming escort wings. They're hailing us, Priya said, startled. First time anyone's tried actual communication instead of just shooting. Put it through, Elena said. The voice that came through the comm was translated a beat behind the original, flat and cold and carrying the particular authority of someone entirely unused to being questioned. Unidentified vessel. This is Grand Marshal Threnvok of the Vantari Empire. You have caused significant disruption to a sanctioned harvest operation. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded, and I will consider allowing your crew to survive this encounter. Elena exchanged a glance with Thomas, who raised an eyebrow in a way that conveyed without a word his full opinion of that offer. Grand Marshal, Elena said, keying her own channel. My name is Elena Voss, captain of the survey vessel Kestrel Rose. I'd like to point out that a sanctioned harvest operation involving 400,000 civilians who never fired a shot at anyone isn't a military operation. It's a massacre with better paperwork. So no, we won't be powering down. There was a pause, long enough that Elena wondered if the translation had failed, before Thren's voice returned, and something in its tone had shifted, gone sharper. You are aware, Captain Voss, that you are one ship, facing my entire fleet. I'm aware, Elena said. I'm also aware that your entire fleet has spent the last several hours chasing decoy transponders through an empty forest while I walked 400 civilians out of your holding pens through your unguarded back door. I'd think carefully about how confident that math actually makes you feel. The silence that followed this time was different. Longer. Heavier, and Elena imagined, though she had no way to confirm it. A Vantari commander somewhere on that command ship, recalculating an equation he'd never once had reason to question in 43 prior campaigns. You are either extraordinarily brave, Thren said finally, or you know something about this engagement that I do not. Maybe both, Elena said. Or maybe you should ask your own historians about a word your archive apparently flagged with a warning label. Deathworlders. Ring any bells, Grand Marshal? The silence this time was absolute, and even through the flat translation, Elena could hear something underneath it. Not quite fear, not yet, but the first genuine crack in a confidence that had never once in 6 years of unchallenged conquest been tested. Sindrata, Thren said very quietly, almost to himself. And then the channel cut, what was that? Priya asked, banking the ship hard as the escort wings finally closed to firing range and the first shots lit up the sky around them. I have no idea, Elena admitted, gripping her seat as the Kestrel Rose juked hard to avoid an incoming volley. But I think we just found the name of whatever it is that made this empire scared of us before we ever showed up. Cass, pull everything you can on Sindrada from any archive we can reach. I want answers, and I have a feeling we're going to need them before this is over. Searching now, Captain, Cass replied. Preliminary results are limited. Most references appear to have been deliberately excised from public Ventari record networks. However, I have located fragments in older, uncatalogued archive nodes not fully purged during whatever process removed the primary records. Show me, Elena said, weaving through a storm of incoming fire as 3 escort wings and, closing fast behind them, the vast dark shape of Threnvok's own command ship converged on the kestrel rose from every direction at once. Displaying now, Captain, Cass said, and on the small secondary screen beside the helm, a fragment of very old, very damaged text began to resolve. The first real answer, after 11 hours of running on instinct and inherited habit, to the question of exactly what humanity had once been to people like Threnvok, and why an old woman named Dorsa Kale had never explained why every ship she commanded carried a receiver, built for a call nobody expected to ever come. The fragment was old, corrupted in places, translated through at least 2 intermediary systems before Cass could render it into something readable. But what remained was enough to make even Priya, mid-evasive maneuver, spare it a second glance. Sindrada reclamation campaign initiated by the Second Vantari dynasty against the species designated human, following the discovery of a resource-rich system within the Deathworld's outer colonies. Initial fleet strength 81 vessels under Fleet Marshal Coran Thess. Campaign anticipated minimal resistance based on preliminary reconnaissance indicating a technologically limited, planet-bound species. Engagement duration 11 standard days. Human forces, initially assessed as negligible, demonstrated tactical adaptation inconsistent with available intelligence, including improvised weapon platforms, coordinated multi-species alliance response, and willingness to sustain losses at a rate no engaged Vantari force had previously encountered or, subsequently, ever encountered again. Final engagement resulted in total loss of the Sindrada fleet. Fleet Marshal Thess listed among the casualties. Second Vantari dynasty collapsed within 11 years of the campaign's conclusion. Cause attributed in part to the catastrophic military and political fallout of the Sindrada defeat. Surviving records from the period, heavily redacted by the subsequent Third Dynasty administration, indicate the existence of a broader alliance network, the Deathworlder Accord, established between human forces and several allied species in the aftermath, intended to provide mutual defense coordination should any future conflict arise. Status of this alliance as of current record, unknown. Recommend permanent avoidance of contact with Deathworld classified species pending further intelligence. The fragment ended there, cut off mid-sentence by whatever damage or deliberate excision had claimed the rest of the file. 81 ships, Tomas said slowly, reading over Elena's shoulder as the kestrel rose rocked from a near miss. Total loss. That's not a battle. That's an extermination, and it went the other way. It also explains why nobody currently in this empire remembers any of it, Elena said, gripping her seat as Priya threw the ship into another hard bank. They buried it. An empire that loses its entire founding dynasty to a single military catastrophe doesn't exactly keep that in the recruitment brochures. So the Deathworlder Accord, Nadia said. That receiver Dorsa put on every ship she ever commanded. It wasn't superstition. No, Elena said quietly, watching the fragment on the screen. It was a promise. Somebody, generations ago, made sure that if this ever happened again, if some species out here sent a call for help to an alliance that hadn't existed in 100 years, somebody would still be listening. She thought of Dorsa Kyle, gone 6 years now, never explaining, just insisting in case, and felt something settle into place that had been unformed and instinctual until this exact moment. We're not the first ship to answer this call. We're just the first one in a very long time. Copy that with a side of terrifying, Marcus said over the comm, voice tight with the strain of nursing the engine through evasive maneuvers it was never designed for. Because right now the empire that lost 81 ships to a Deathworlder alliance a couple centuries ago has apparently forgotten why that was a bad idea. And they've got 17 ships and a very angry Grand Marshal converging on the one ship that just reminded them. Then we make sure he remembers hard, Elena said. And something in her voice had changed, not fear, Not even the careful calculation of before, but something colder and more certain. Tomas, damage report. Hull integrity at 81%. We took 2 glancing hits on the port side, nothing critical. Mass drivers down to 4 shots. Missiles are gone. Used our last one on that escort ship hours ago. Then we're not winning this with firepower, Elena said. We never were. Priya, how close is the command ship? Closing fast. It'll be in effective range in under 2 minutes, and Elena, that thing's not built like the escorts. Full military hull, heavy shielding. We can't outturn something that size in open sky. Not for long. Elena studied the tactical display. The 17-ship formation converging from every angle. The vast dark shape of the Ashvane's reckoning bearing down on them with the accumulated weight of an empire that had never once needed to fight for a victory, and was now, for the first time in 6 years, genuinely afraid. An idea began to form. Reckless, desperate, and exactly the kind of thing Dorsa Kale would have called the only option left worth trying. Cass, pull up the Delta terrain again, the one we used for the extraction, and give me everything we have on Vantari's shield technology, specifically anything related to close-range electromagnetic vulnerability. One moment, Captain. A pause. I have partial data from the fragment archive. Vantari military shielding, while effective against conventional weapons fire, is documented as having reduced effectiveness against sustained, close-range electromagnetic disruption and a vulnerability apparently exploited during the original Sindrata campaign through improvised means. Elena felt something click into place. Marcus, the salvage rig's magnetic grapple array, the one we use for pulling derelict hulls together for towing. What's its maximum output? There was a pause on the comm, and Elena could practically hear Marcus doing the math. It's, Captain, that thing's built to move dead mass, not disrupt live shields. But if you're asking whether we could overload it and discharge the whole array in one burst at close range? Another pause. It'd probably melt half our own systems doing it. And you'd need to be close. Suicidally close. How close? Point blank, Captain. We're talking a few 100 meters. Close enough that if the burst doesn't work, we don't get a second chance to try something else. Elena looked at the tactical display, at the Ashvane's reckoning closing the distance. At 17, ships and an empire's worth of accumulated confidence bearing down on one battered survey vessel, with 4 shots left in its mass driver and a crew that had, 11 hours ago, been asleep on a routine patrol at the edge of known space. Then that's the plan, she said. We're not going to outgun Threnvok's fleet. We're going to fly straight at his command ship, close enough to make every gunner on that vessel hesitate. And when we're close enough that hesitating is the worst possible choice, we're going to knock out his shields and make him remember exactly why his ancestors were terrified of a word he'd forgotten existed. That's insane, Thomas said, but he was already moving to recheck the mass driver's remaining charges, because insane on this crew had stopped meaning no a long time ago. Probably, Elena agreed. But an empire that's never been meaningfully challenged doesn't know how to process an enemy that flies straight at it instead of running. We're about to teach Grand Marshal Threnvok a lesson his own dynasty tried very hard to make sure nobody ever had to learn again. Priya's hands tightened on the controls, and the Kestrel rose, battered and outgunned and flown by a crew that had answered a call nobody expected anyone to still be listening for, turned to face the largest warship in the Vantari fleet head-on. They're not slowing down, Scarrett said, staring at the tactical display in open disbelief as the small human vessel, instead of breaking off or attempting evasive retreat, altered course and began accelerating directly toward the Ashvane's reckoning. Threnvok stood very still at the command console, watching the same display, feeling the cold certainty of the Sindrata fragment settle deeper into his chest with every kilometer the human ship closed. That's not an attack run, he said slowly. Look at the vector. They're not lining up a firing solution. They're coming straight at us. A collision course? Scarrett's voice carried genuine alarm now. Perhaps. Thren studied the small, battered profile of the human vessel on the display. A ship that had, by any rational measure, no business surviving this long against his fleet, let alone continuing to press an attack. Or perhaps they intend something we haven't anticipated yet, which appears to be the pattern of this entire engagement. He straightened. All batteries target the incoming vessel. Full spread. I want it destroyed before it reaches effective range of whatever it's planning. Yes. Grand Marshal. The Ashvane's Reckoning's main batteries opened fire, and the sky around the Kestrel Rose erupted into a storm of incoming ordnance that Priya wove through with a precision that came from 11 years of flying an old, unglamorous ship through exactly this kind of impossible margin. Hull integrity down to 62%, Cass reported, flat and unhurried even as the ship shuddered under a near miss. "We are taking sustained fire, Captain. Keep us on course," Elena said, gripping her seat, watching the range counter tick down. "Marcus, status on the grapple array." "Charged and ready, but Captain, once we discharge this, we're not getting a second attempt. The array's not built for this. It'll burn out the moment we fire it. Then we make the first attempt count." Elena watched the range counter continue to fall. 800 meters, 700, 600, while incoming fire tore past the Kestrel Rose close enough that Elena could feel the hull groan with every near-miss shockwave. "Thomas, mass driver, full charge. Target their forward shield emitter array the instant Marcus fires the grapple burst. If we can hit a destabilized shield section before it reconstitutes, we might actually put a real hole in that hull." "Copy that. Standing by. 500 meters. 400. The Ashvane's Reckoning loomed enormous on the forward viewport now. A vast dark wall of alloy and weapon emplacements. Every gun that could bear tracking the small, stubborn shape of a survey ship that refused to break off. "Grand Marshal," Scarrett said, an edge of something close to panic creeping into his voice as the range continued to close. "They're not veering off. Recommend immediate evasive maneuvering. We cannot guarantee point defense coverage at this range. Hold position," Thren said, and even he could hear the strain in his own voice now. The first genuine uncertainty he had felt in longer than he cared to admit. If they intended to ram us, they would have committed to a straight vector minutes ago. They're doing something else. "I want to know what before we— 200 meters, Priya called out, voice tight. "Now, Marcus," Elena said. "Fire it now." The Kestrel Rose's salvage grapple array, never designed for anything more dramatic than dragging derelict, hulls into a towing formation, discharged its entire overloaded capacity in a single violent burst of electromagnetic energy, point-blank into the forward shield array of the largest warship in the Vantari fleet. For a fraction of a second, nothing visible happened at all. Then the Ashvane's Reckoning's forward shields flickered, buckled and collapsed in a cascading failure that raced backward across the entire projection field, systems overloading in a chain reaction that no Vantari engineer had ever needed to design a defense against, because no enemy in 6 years of unchallenged conquest had ever gotten close enough or been reckless enough to try. "Shields down," Scarrett shouted, disbelief cracking his usually flat voice wide open. "Forward array is completely offline." "Grand Marshal, I don't— Tomas, fire," Elena said. The mass driver's remaining charge streaked across the closing gap and struck the Ashvane's Reckoning's exposed forward hull dead center, tearing through unshielded armor plating in a spray of debris and venting atmosphere that lit up the darkness of high orbit like a dying star. It was not a killing blow. It could never have been, not from a single mass driver round against a ship of that size, but it was a wound. The first wound the Ashvane's Reckoning had taken in its entire operational history, torn open by a battered survey vessel that had, by every measure Threnvok's 43 campaigns had ever taught him to trust. No business surviving this engagement at all. On the bridge of the Kestrel Rose, alarms shrieked as the grapple array's catastrophic overload cascaded through their own systems, and the ship shuddered violently, half its secondary systems flickering out at once. "Grapple array is fried," Marcus reported, voice tight over the roar of failing systems. "Completely gone. And Captain, we're losing power to the main drive. That overload backfed through more of the ship than I expected. Can you get it back?" "Working on it. Give me a minute." "We don't have a minute," Priya said, watching the Ashvane's Reckoning and its 16 escort vessels, momentarily stunned into stillness by the impossible sight of their flagship wounded, begin to react. "Elena, they're going to swarm us the second they recover from the shock." Elena looked at the tactical display, her ship crippled, drifting, main drive offline, a crippled but very much still lethal command ship and 16 fully armed escorts closing in around them, and felt, for the first time since the 11-hour burn began, the genuine possibility that this was the moment everything they had done would not be enough. "Marcus," she said, quiet and level despite the alarm still shrieking around her. "Whatever you need to do, do it now. Because I did not fly 211 light years to answer a call for help, just to lose everything in the last 5 minutes of the fight. Across the darkening bridge of the Kestrel rose, systems flickering in and out under the strain of the backfed overload. Marcus Aldana worked with the particular desperate focus of a man who had spent 11 years keeping this exact ship alive through worse odds than this and had no intention of letting today be the exception. Main. Drives not responding to standard restart, he reported, voice tight. The overload didn't just fry the grapple array. It tripped every safety interlock in the power distribution grid. I can bypass them, but it means running the core hot. And if I misjudge it by even a little, we're not looking at a crippled ship anymore. We're looking at no ship at all. Do it, Elena said. We've got maybe 90 seconds before that fleet stops being stunned and starts being angry. And I'd rather take my chances with an overloaded core than sit here waiting for 16 ships to remember how to shoot. On the bridge of the Ashvane's reckoning, Thren Vok stood amid the chaos of a command deck that had never once, in his entire career, needed to process a genuine hull breach. Watching damage control teams scramble to seal the tear, the small human vessel had torn through forward armor that had never been meaningfully tested before. Grand Marshal, Scarrett said, voice still unsteady. The human vessel is drifting. Their main drive appears to be offline. We could destroy it, Thren finished, and found to his own quiet astonishment that the order didn't come as easily as it should have. 43 campaigns, 43 worlds that had learned in one form or another exactly why resistance was futile against the Vantari Empire. He had never once hesitated to give this order before. All escort wings, converge on the disabled vessel. Finish it. 16 ships began to move. Cores spinning up, Marcus called out, sweat visible on his brow even over the comm audio. 10 seconds. 9. They're closing, Priya said, watching the tactical display fill with converging Vantari escorts, weapons hot, closing the distance with the speed of ships no longer stunned into hesitation. Elena, they're going to be in firing range before Marcus is done. Elena looked at the display, at 16 ships closing on her crippled drifting vessel, and made a decision that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the 11 years she'd spent learning exactly what this crew was capable of when the only alternative was giving up. Cass, open a channel. All frequencies, full broadcast, everything we've got. I want every ship in that fleet to hear this. Channel open. Captain. This is Captain Elena Voss of the Kestrel Rose, she said, and her voice, broadcast wide across the Vantari fleet's open channels, carried none of the fear that anyone in her position had every right to feel. To Grand Marshal Thren Vok and every crew in this fleet, you've spent the last several hours learning that the word your own archives flagged with a warning label wasn't superstition. It was a memory. One ship did this to your forward shields and your flagship's hull. One ship, crewed by 5 people with a fuel budget your empire would consider beneath notice. 3 seconds, Marcus called out. Before you finish what you started here, Elena continued, watching the converging ships on the display. I want you to ask yourselves exactly one question. If one ship could do this much damage in a single afternoon, what do you think? Happens when the rest of the people who built the Deathworlder Accord find out you tried to erase 400,000 civilians who never fired a single shot at anyone. Cores up, Marcus shouted. That question, Elena said, is the only mercy you're getting from us today. And the Kestrel Rose's main drive roared back to life, hauling the ship into a hard, screaming climb directly through the closing formation of Vantari escorts, close enough that 3 of them broke formation entirely, rather than risk a collision with a vessel that had, in the space of a single engagement, made every single one of their crews viscerally afraid of getting too close to it. It was not a rational fear. In the strictest tactical sense, the Kestrel Rose had no weapons left, no shields to speak of, nothing but a crippled hull and a crew running on adrenaline and inherited nerve. But fear, Elena had learned a long time ago in a life she rarely talked about, was never really about the math. It was about what an enemy believed you were capable of, and for the first time in 6 years, Thren Vok's fleet no longer believed they knew the answer to that question. They're breaking formation, Priya said, incredulous, watching 3 escorts scatter clear of their climbing trajectory. Elena, they're actually letting us through. Keep climbing, Elena said. Get us clear of the gravity well before anyone remembers they still have the numbers to finish this if they just commit to it. On the bridge of the Ashvane's reckoning, Thren Vok watched the small human vessel claw its way clear of his fleet's formation, watched 3 of his own escort crews break away rather than risk direct engagement, and felt something that had no place in the career of a Grand Marshal with 43 victories to his name. He felt, for the first time since the Sindrata fragment had surfaced on his display 11 hours ago, something close to genuine fear. "Grand Marshal," Scarrett said quietly. "Orders?" Thren stared at the tactical display for a long moment, at his wounded flagship, at his scattered, shaken escort wings, at the small, battered shape of a ship that should, by every rational measure available to him, have been destroyed an hour ago and had instead torn a hole through his forward hull and his command's confidence in the same afternoon. "Recall the harvest teams," he said finally. "All of them." "We're leaving this system, sir." Scarrett's disbelief was open now, undisguised. "We still hold overwhelming numerical superiority. That vessel is crippled and fleeing. We could lose more ships chasing a single crippled vessel that has already cost us more than any world in 6 years of campaign," Thren said. And the weight of the Sindrata fragment sat heavy behind every word. "One ship did this, Scarrett. One. I have spent my entire career believing the Deathworlder Accord was a superstition my ancestors invented to explain away a single catastrophic defeat 2 centuries ago. I am no longer certain of that. And I am not willing to discover how many more ships like this one are still out there answering that same call. Not while my fleet sits exposed in a system I have already spent a full day trying and failing to fully secure." He turned away from the display. "Signal full withdrawal. We are done here." Behind them, drifting clear of the gravity well with a crippled drive and a hull held together by nothing more than Marcus Aldana's stubbornness and 11 years of accumulated skill, the Kestrel Rose watched the impossible happen on their own tactical display. 17 Vantari warships, an entire harvest fleet that had never once failed to complete a conquest, breaking formation and beginning one by one to withdraw. "They're leaving," Nadia said, voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loud might undo it. "Elena, they're actually leaving." Elena watched the fleet retreat, watched the smoking ruin of Kethara Station recede behind them, watched the first genuine breath any of them had taken without immediate crisis in longer than she could track, and allowed herself finally a single moment of something that felt very close to relief. "Get me Il Vesto," she said. "I think it's time somebody down there heard some good news." The withdrawal took 4 hours to complete, and Elena watched every minute of it from the drifting, battered bridge of the Kestrel Rose. Half convinced until the very last, Vantari's ship vanished into slip space that Thren Vok would change his mind and turn the fleet back. Around he didn't. By the time the last warship's slip signature faded from their sensors, the sky over Ilion was, for the first time in nearly a full day, entirely clear of anything that wasn't Kethari. "They're really gone," Priya said, still watching the empty display as if she expected it to be a trick. "They're gone," Elena confirmed, and let herself sag back into the command chair for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "Marcus, how are we holding together?" "Barely," Marcus said, emerging from the engine room looking like a man who had personally wrestled the ship back from the edge of destruction, which was not far from the truth. "Core's stable, but I wouldn't recommend another hard burn without proper dock time. Grapple array's completely gone. We lost 2 secondary power couplings. And I've got a hull breach on deck too I've been holding together with sealant foam and pure spite. But we're alive." "She's alive." He patted the nearest bulkhead with something like genuine affection. "You did good, old girl." "We all did," Nadia said quietly. And nobody argued. Down on Ilion's surface, in the marshland where 412 civilians had spent 4 terrifying hours, hidden among the reeds, not knowing whether they would live to see the ship that saved them return, Il Vesto stood watching the clear sky and felt the particular disbelief of someone who had, 12 hours ago, genuinely believed she was watching her people's final day. The Kestrel Rose descended through the marshland's thin morning mist, scorched and battered and unmistakably, gloriously present, and set down in the same clearing it had lifted off from hours before. Elena stepped out into a crowd of Kethari civilians who had, until this exact moment, existed to her only as a distress call and an 11-hour burn through open space. Il Vesto met her at the edge of the crowd, her young nephew still clinging to her side, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "You came back," Ale said finally. "I said I would," Elena said. "Your fleet's gone. Full withdrawal. I don't know if it's permanent, but it's a start." "You drove off 17 warships," Ale said, and there was something in her voice that was equal parts disbelief and something that might, given time, become reverence. "With one ship. My grandmother told me stories about the Deathworlders when I was young. Half-remembered fragments from an accord nobody living had ever actually seen invoked. I never believed any of it was real. I certainly never believed I would live to watch it happen. Neither did I 12 hours ago," Elena admitted. "I didn't know what we were flying into when we answered your call. I still don't fully understand the history behind it. But I know your people are alive, and I know that's what mattered." Ale studied her for a long moment. This strange, small, unassuming figure who had walked out of a ruined doorway 12 hours ago and somehow, impossibly, changed the trajectory of an entire invasion. What happens now? They could come back. With more ships. With a fleet that knows what to expect this time. They could, Elena said honestly. I won't pretend otherwise. But Cass, my ship's AI, has been broadcasting everything that happened here across every relay we can reach since the moment your fleet started retreating. The old Deathworlder frequencies. Whatever's left of that network, however many ships or worlds are still listening after all this time. She looked up at the clearing sky, thinking of Dorsa Kale, and a receiver installed out of habit, and a promise she was only now beginning to understand the shape of. If there's one ship left out there that still answers that call, there might be more than one. And now every world that hears what happened here knows the Accord isn't dead. It's just been quiet. Grand Marshal Threnvok's report reached Vantari Imperial Command 11 days later, and the political fallout began within the week. It was not the loss of a single harvest world that caused the crisis. Vantari Command had absorbed setbacks before, small ones easily buried in the vast machinery of Imperial record-keeping. It was the report's second half, the part where a decorated Grand Marshal with 43 prior victories formally requested that Imperial Command reactivate the ancient Deathworld avoidance protocols, and attached as supporting evidence, a fully reconstructed copy of the Sindrata reclamation records that the Third Dynasty had spent 2 centuries trying to make sure nobody ever found again, the revelation that the Empire's own founding dynasty had been destroyed by the very species it had spent 6 years, unknowingly provoking, traveled through Vantari political and military circles like wildfire. Within a month, 3 border sectors that had been quietly chafing under Imperial rule for years used the crisis of confidence as cover to formally declare independence. Within 3 months, 2 more Grand Marshals, emboldened by Threnvok's example and increasingly skeptical of a command structure that had apparently buried a catastrophic historical defeat rather than learn from it, refused direct orders for further harvest campaigns pending a full military review. The Vantari Empire did not collapse overnight. Empires rarely do. But the machine that had conquered 43 worlds in 6 years, without ever once needing to seriously fight for a single one of them, ground to a slow, uncertain halt, riddled with internal doubt and rebellion and the particular, corrosive fear of an enemy nobody currently serving had ever actually seen, but that every single record now confirmed was real, and had beaten them before and might still be out there, waiting. 6 months later, the Kestrel Rose sat in dry dock on a modest shipyard station on the edge of what had once been contested Vantari territory, and was now, tentatively calling itself the Ilian Compact, a small alliance of a dozen worlds, Ketathari-led, that had banded together in the wake of the Empire's retreat and rebuilt the old Deathworlder Accord frequencies into something active again, something monitored, something with actual ships attached to actual promises. Elena stood on the observation deck watching the repair crews finish the last of the hull work, new plating over the scars, a rebuilt grapple array that Marcus had insisted on personally over-engineering just in case, and thought about how strange it was that a promise made by people long dead, carried forward by a woman who never explained why, had ended up mattering this much. "You've got a visitor," Nadia said. Appearing at her shoulder, Aelvesto crossed the observation deck a moment later. No longer the frightened station commander of 6 months ago, but something steadier, sharper, a woman who had spent half a year helping build a coalition out of the wreckage of a near-extinction event. The compacts formally invited humanity to establish a permanent liaison presence, Ale said, without preamble, because she had learned quickly that Elena appreciated people who got to the point. Not just your ship, an actual presence. A voice at the table. Elena raised an eyebrow. That's a big ask for a species most of your world still think is a ghost story. You're not a ghost story anymore, Ale said simply. You're the ship that answered. Elena looked out at the stars, at the quiet shipyard at a future that had started 12 hours and a lifetime ago, with an alarm going off at 0347 ship time and a crew that hadn't hesitated, not once, when the moment came to decide what kind of people they were going to be. I'll take that offer back to Earth, she said. But I want you to understand something, Ale. We didn't do this because we're heroes. We did it because a signal came in, and someone was listening, and that's supposed to mean something. If your compact wants a partner, that's what you're going to get. Not saviors, not legends. Just people who show up when it matters. Ale studied her for a long moment, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face. In my experience, Captain Voss, that's usually the difference between the two. Behind them, in the quiet dark of the shipyard, the Kestrel Rose sat gleaming under new plating, scarred but whole, ready, and 211 light-years away and counting. Across a galaxy that had spent generations believing an old promise was dead, more receivers in more forgotten corners of human space waited in silence for the next call that would prove it never really was. The empire that had once believed humanity too primitive to notice had learned, in the span of a single desperate afternoon, exactly how wrong that belief had been. And across a dozen worlds and a slowly rebuilding alliance, the story of the one ship that answered when nobody else would spread further with every telling, growing as the best stories always do, into something that would outlast every empire foolish enough to have forgotten why the warning label had been there in the first place.